The night my husband's company landed the Hartwell contract, I stood in a borrowed dress and smiled until my face ached. It was the kind of smile you learn after 7 years of marriage to a man whose family never quite accepted you. Polite, measured, wide enough to pass but not wide enough to invite conversation. I had it perfected by then. The venue was the Shangri-La in downtown Toronto, the kind of place where the napkins are folded into swans, and the sommelier knows your husband's father by name. My father-in-law Gerald had booked the private dining room on the 32nd floor. Floor-to-soiling windows, the city lights spread out below us like something out of a dream. 60 people, maybe more. Business partners, board members, old family friends who'd known my husband since he was in diapers. I knew maybe 4 of them well enough to call by name. My husband, I'll call him my husband because that's what he was. And I still can't quite say his name without feeling that specific kind of tired. Had been working on the Hartwell construction tender for 11 months. 11 months of 7 a.m. starts and midnight phone calls and weekends, where I sat on our couch in Mississauga with a cold cup of tea, watching the driveway, waiting for his headlights. His family's development firm had beaten out 3 bigger competitors for a $200 million infrastructure project outside of Hamilton. It was the biggest deal they'd ever closed. I was proud of him. I want to say that clearly, because the rest of this story might make it seem otherwise. I genuinely was. But I also knew, in the way you'd know things you're not ready to say out loud, that I hadn't been invited to this party as his partner. I'd been invited as an accessory, something that matched the occasion. Gerald stood at the head of the table and gave a toast that lasted 12 minutes. I counted. He talked about legacy, about the family name, about his late wife who'd started the company with him in a rented office in Scarborough 30 years ago. He talked about his son, about how he'd always known, always believed. And there were actual tears, which surprised me because Gerald had always struck me as a man who found emotion professionally inconvenient. He did not mention me once. I had spent 4 years working as a contracts administrator at a competing firm before I married into this family, and quietly stepped back from full-time work at their request. I had read every page of the Hartwell tender documents. I had caught 2 errors in the liability clauses that would have cost them, at minimum, $800,000 in penalties if the project went sideways. Gerald did not mention me once. I raised my glass when everyone else raised theirs. I smiled the smile. I let the applause wash over me. And I looked down at the breadcrumbs on my charger plate and I thought, I am so tired of being invisible in rooms where I have earned the right to be seen. That was when the water glass went over. I heard it before I felt it. A sharp crack of crystal against the edge of the table, and then cold water spread across the white tablecloth and hit my lap in one sudden soaking wave. People closest to me pushed back their chairs. Someone said, "Oh no," in that hushed, horrified way that's worse than if they'd just laughed. The server was beside me in an instant, already crouching with a linen cloth, his face flushed deep red under the dining room lights. He was young, maybe 23, 24, with close-cut dark hair and the kind of careful posture you develop when you work a job where invisibility is a professional requirement. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," he said quietly, pressing the linen to the edge of the table. "That was entirely my fault. Please, can I help you step out for a moment?" "The coat room just down the hall. There's a steamer, it'll take 5 minutes," my mother-in-law. Gerald's sister, who had taken on that role in the family after his wife passed, was already reaching across to pat my arm with a look on her face that I recognized. The look that meant, this is what happens when the table is too crowded. "Go fix yourself up," she said, which was meant to sound kind and didn't. I followed the server into the corridor. The hallway outside the private dining room was quiet, all thick carpet and muted gold sconces. He walked quickly, glancing once over his shoulder back toward the doors, and then instead of turning toward the coat room, he paused at a small alcove near the service entrance and looked at me with an expression I hadn't expected. Serious. Deliberate. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I don't have much time before they notice I'm gone." I stared at him. My dress was still dripping. "I did that on purpose," he said. "The water. I'm sorry. I didn't know a better way to get you out of the room without it looking intentional. I've been trying to figure out how to get to you all evening. My first instinct was to be angry. My second instinct, something quieter animal, told me to listen." "What's your name?" I asked. "Theo," he said. "I'm a student. I do event catering on weekends. I'm in my 3rd year of commerce at U of K, Theo," I said. "What is it?" He reached into the breast pocket of his uniform jacket and pulled out his phone. He turned the screen toward me. It was a text message thread. The contact name at the top was saved as Hartwell Contact, RM. "I do some part-time bookkeeping for a guy named Russell Mercer," Theo said. "He works for the Provincial Infrastructure Office. He's the one who oversees tender compliance on the Hartwell project." He paused, 3 weeks ago, he showed me a document. He thought it was funny. He wanted my opinion on whether it was even legal. I looked at the screen. The messages were fragmented, abbreviated, the kind of shorthand people use when they think they're being careful. But the meaning wasn't hard to follow. There were references to adjusted site valuations, references to a numbered company registered in Alberta, references to a clause in the Hartwell contract that had been quietly altered between the draft version and the signed version. A change that would allow a third party to absorb a significant portion of the project's subcontracting revenue without public disclosure. The third party was a holding company. The holding company was controlled by my husband's older brother, my brother-in-law, Dennis, who had left the family firm 6 years ago after what everyone politely called a disagreement about the company's direction. And what I knew, from 7 years of holiday dinners and careful silences, was a falling out over money that had never fully healed. "There's more," Theo said. He scrolled down. "This part is about you." I looked. The message was from a different number, no name saved. But the words were clear. The wife has signing authority on 3 of the legacy accounts. She needs to be out of the picture before the audit window in January. Gerald agrees. The husband will manage it. I read it twice. Then I read it again. The hallway was very quiet. Somewhere behind the service door, I could hear the muffled clink of glassware, the low hum of a commercial refrigerator. "How do you know this is connected to tonight?" I asked. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Because Russell is in that room," Theo said. "He's at the far end of the table. He's been here since 6 o'clock and he arrived with your brother-in-law." I hadn't recognized him. I'd been introduced to so many people that evening, shaken so many hands. But when I thought back, the heavy-set man with the gray tie, the one who'd laughed too loudly at Gerald's toast, yes, I'd wondered idly who he was. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Theo hesitated then. "My mom went through something like this. Her business partner did something similar. Not this scale, but the same idea. She didn't find out until it was too late to do anything. She lost everything." He looked down at the phone in his hand. "I've been sitting on this for 3 weeks trying to figure out what to do. When I saw your name on the guest list tonight, I looked you up. You were a contracts administrator before you married in. You'd know what this means." I did know what it meant. Signing authority on the legacy accounts meant I had legal standing to flag irregularities. It meant that if someone wanted to restructure those accounts, or quietly move them, they needed either my cooperation or my absence. The audit window in January was when the Hartwell project's first compliance review was due. If irregularities in the subcontracting structure were going to be buried, it needed to happen before then, and it needed to happen without me in a position to notice or object. "The husband will manage it." I thought about the last few months. The conversations that had trailed off when I walked into rooms. The business dinner I'd been told last minute was just partners. The time my husband had asked, very casually, whether I'd considered going back to work, whether it might be good for me to have something of my own again, separate from the family company. I had thought he was being considerate. "Can you forward me those screenshots?" I asked. "Already done," Theo said. "I sent them to an email address I found on an old professional profile of yours, 20 minutes ago." He'd sent them before he even got to me. That meant he'd already decided, before the water glass, before any of this, that he was going to find a way to hand this to someone who could do something with it. I looked at him for a moment. 23 years old, commerce student, weekend caterer, standing in a hotel corridor risking his job, and God knows what else to give me something that most people in his position would have walked away from. "Go back to work," I said. "Don't talk to Russell Mercer again. Don't tell anyone what you told me. And Theo, thank you." He nodded once, tucked his phone away, and pushed back through the service door. I stood in the alcove for another minute until my breathing settled. Then I walked back into the dining room, sat down in my chair, and finished the rest of the evening with a smile on my face that was, for the first time that night, entirely intentional. I didn't say anything to my husband that night, not in the car on the way home, not while he replayed highlights of Gerald's toast with the specific kind of satisfaction that means a man is performing happiness for his own benefit, not when he fell asleep with the television on, and I sat in the dark kitchen in Mississauga at 1 in the morning, reading and rereading the forwarded screenshots on my laptop. I needed to be sure before I moved, and I needed to move before I was expected to. The next morning I called my cousin Judith, who is a corporate lawyer in Ottawa, and who has never once in 37 years given me bad advice. I sent her the screenshots. I told her everything. I could hear her breathing change on the other end of the line. That particular shift, that means someone is already 3 steps ahead of what you're telling them. "Don't touch the accounts," she said. "Don't log in. Don't access anything. Don't give anyone any reason to say you were interfering. Do you have any documentation from when you were doing the contract work? Anything in writing? I had everything in writing. I had always kept everything in writing. It was one of the habits I'd carried over from my years in the industry, a quiet, unglamorous form of self-preservation that had never felt more relevant than it did at that moment. Okay, Judith said. Here's what we're going to do. What we did over the next 11 days was build a paper record, not an accusation, a documentation, a timeline of the irregularities in the Hartwell subcontracting structure, cross-referenced against the public procurement records available through the provincial tender registry, cross-referenced again against the corporate registry filings for the Alberta Holding Company, which was technically public information if you knew where to look and had the patience to look carefully. Judith contacted the Provincial Infrastructure Auditor's Office directly, not the Hartwell Compliances team. The auditor's office, the one that operated independently of the project oversight structure. She requested a preliminary review. She did this as my legal representative, not on behalf of the family company, not on behalf of anyone except me, the person who held signing authority on accounts that were about to be materially affected by transactions I had not been informed of. The review was opened within a week. My husband found out on a Tuesday. He came home early, mid-afternoon, which never happened, and I was in the kitchen making tea, and I knew from the way he shut the front door that something had shifted. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen with his coat still on, and he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him before. Not angry. More like someone who had just run the numbers on a situation and didn't like what they came out to. The auditor's office called Gerald this morning, he said. Okay, I said. They said the review was initiated by your legal representative. That's right, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Genevieve, he said, and my name in his mouth sounded like a door closing slowly. What did you do? I reported irregularities in the Hartwell subcontracting structure that would have directly affected accounts to which I hold signing authority, I said, which I was legally obligated to do once I became aware of them. You didn't tell me. No, I said. I didn't. He sat down at the kitchen table. He put his face in his hands and he stayed like that for a long time. Outside, the neighbor's maple was dropping its last leaves, the October wind scattering them across our driveway. Dennis told me it was clean, he finally said. He told me the restructuring was a formality, a tax efficiency measure. I looked at him. And you believed him. He's my brother. He's a man who left your family's company over a money dispute, I said quietly, and then spent 6 years finding a way back in through a side door. I don't know if he'd genuinely not understood what Dennis had done, or if he'd understood it partially and chosen not to look too closely. I've turned that question over for a long time, and I still don't have an answer. What I do know is that the message I'd seen on Theo's phone, "The husband will manage it," meant someone had expected him to handle my removal from the situation, and he hadn't pushed back on that, not out loud, not in a way I could point to. That is its own kind of answer. The provincial audit found the irregularities. Dennis's holding company was flagged. Russell Mercer, the infrastructure official, resigned from his position in November, pending a professional conduct review. The Hartwell project itself was not cancelled. The contract was too far along and too important to the provincial budget, but the subcontracting structure was unwound and renegotiated, and the family company's profit margins on the project were significantly reduced as a result. Gerald did not speak to me for 3 months. My husband and I separated in February. It was quieter than I expected. We sat at the same kitchen table where I'd watched him put his face in his hands, and we talked for 2 hours. And at the end of it, we had agreed on the broad strokes. The house would be sold, the proceeds split, the lawyers would handle the rest. He wasn't a bad person. I want to say that too, clearly. He was a person who had grown up inside a family that moved like a closed system, and had never quite learned how to see outside of it. I moved into a 1-bedroom in the annex. I made myself tea in a new kitchen every morning, and listened to the street noises and felt, beneath the grief and the exhaustion and the strangeness of rebuilding, something I hadn't felt in years. Like I was taking up the right amount of space. I looked Theo up in the spring. It wasn't hard. He was exactly where he said he'd be, finishing his 3rd year of commerce at U of T, his LinkedIn profile listing his catering work and his bookkeeping side jobs, with the meticulous detail of someone who understood that every credential matters when you're starting from scratch. I sent him an email. I asked if he'd be willing to meet for coffee. We met at a place on Bloor Street, one of those old-school diners that's been there since the 90s, booths with cracked vinyl, coffee that comes in a ceramic mug without anyone asking if you want a single-origin pour-over. Theo arrived 5 minutes early. He was taller than I remembered. Or maybe I'd been too shaken to register his height properly in that hotel corridor. He sat across from me and wrapped both hands around his coffee mug and said, "How did it all turn out?" I told him. "All of it." He listened without interrupting, which is rarer than it should be. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, I almost didn't say anything. That night, I kept second-guessing myself in the corridor, thinking maybe I'd read it wrong, maybe it wasn't my place. "What made you do it anyway?" I asked. He thought about it. "I kept thinking about my mom," he said. "What it would have meant if someone had told her. If someone who knew had just said something." He shrugged. A small, contained movement. It felt like, if you had the information and you sat on it, that was a choice. You know? Not doing something is still doing something. I looked at him across the table and I thought, here is a 24-year-old kid who works weekends to pay for school and does bookkeeping on the side and has, apparently, a more developed sense of moral responsibility than most of the people who'd been in that Shangri-La dining room combined. "I wanted to ask you something," I said. He looked up. "I've been brought on as a compliance consultant by a mid-sized development firm here in the city. I'm rebuilding something of my own." I paused. "They have a junior analyst position opening in September, entry level, but the exposure is good. Procurement compliance, contract review, some audit support. It would count toward your CPA hours." He stares at me. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't," I said. "That's why I'm doing it." He looked down at his coffee mug. I watched something shift in his face. Relief, maybe, or something quieter than relief. The particular feeling of being seen by someone who had reason to look away instead. "I'd have to finish my farce," he said. "September," I said. "Whenever you're ready." He smiled. It was the first time I'd seen him smile. In the hotel corridor, he'd been too tense, too focused. It changed his whole face. We finished our coffee and walked out onto Bloor Street into the thin April sunshine, and he shook my hand at the corner before we went our separate ways. And I walked back to the annex, through streets that were just starting to come back to life after the winter. Green pushing up through the verges, the city remembering how to breathe. I thought about the night at the Shangri-La. The borrowed dress, the 40-minute toast, the smile I'd been holding in place for 7 years. I thought about the moment cold water hit my lap and how my first instinct, even then, was to be embarrassed. To minimize, to manage, to make it easier for everyone around me. I wasn't embarrassed anymore. I was starting over, in a city I loved, at a job I'd chosen for myself, with a clarity I hadn't had in years. And somewhere across town, a 24-year-old commerce student was finishing his finals, and I hoped, beginning to understand something I'd had to learn the hard way. That the smallest act of decency, in the right moment, can change the entire shape of someone's life, including your own.